Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be a fascinating deep dive today. We're going to be looking at insider movements in Christianity. And to help us unpack all of this, we'll be looking at Pasted Text, a book by author's name.
Great to be here.
So this book really challenges some of the traditional approaches to missions. Like, get ready to rethink some assumptions.
Yeah, it really throws down the gauntlet.
It does.
It does, and I think the way the author starts is really captivating. He uses this analogy of a halfway bridge.
Oh, yeah.
He describes coming across an actual bridge that just stops in the middle of a river,
Oh,
leading
yeah.
to nowhere. And it's just this really powerful image of incomplete communication.
Yeah, I can just picture that. Like, what's the point, right?
Right.
And then he connects it to how we often try to share the gospel. And it really clicks. It's like we're building this bridge halfway using all this, like, theological jargon
Mm-hmm.
or culturally irrelevant examples,
Mm-hmm.
and then expecting people to just, like, figure out the rest on their own.
Right. It's like, here's half a bridge. Good luck. He actually tells this kind of funny story about an American pastor who's speaking in Japan. And he's using all these like American idioms that the audience just doesn't understand.
Yeah, I bet.
It's like trying to explain baseball to someone who's never even seen a bat, you know?
Yeah.
You can describe the rules all day long, but without that shared context, it just won't click.
It just goes right over their heads.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder how many times we've done that without even realizing it.
Hmm.
Trying to share something profound, but failing to make those crucial cultural connections.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that leads into another really key point that he makes in the book, which is that the gospel is ultimately a person, not just a collection of words.
Okay, so what does that actually mean? Like, how do we put that into practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, take John 1.1, for example. The familiar translation says, "In the beginning was the Word."
Yeah.
But the author points out how that phrasing can kind of unintentionally reinforce the static, word-centric view of faith. So he actually highlights a different translation, which is, "At the beginning, God expressed himself."
Okay.
And that expression took the form of Jesus. And it shifts the focus from simply transmitting information to embodying and demonstrating the faith.
Okay, so it's not just preaching words, but it's about something more.
Right, exact.
Okay, so then what does spreading the gospel even look like in that context?
Yeah, so he actually makes this really interesting distinction between faith and religion that I think helps clarify this a bit.
I'm listening.
So he argues that religion, with all of its rituals and doctrines and structures, is inherently cultural.
Mm.
It can be adapted, but the core elements often remain tied to that originating culture.
Okay, so where does faith fit into that then?
Yeah, so faith, on the other hand,
Okay.
is about a personal commitment and relationship with God,
Uh-huh.
which can then be expressed authentically within different cultural forms.
Okay.
So it's about the heart, not just the outward forms.
So you can adapt the external rituals, but the core of faith needs to be contextualized.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where insider movements come in.
Cool.
They're all about fostering culturally relevant expressions of Christianity.
But wouldn't that create a whole bunch of different variations and maybe even conflicts?
It does. It certainly leads to diversity, but that's kind of the point. Instead of imposing an outsider's framework, insider movements allow the faith to take root and grow organically within a culture. And the key here is that those expressions are deemed appropriate by insiders themselves, not by outsiders.
Okay, so it's coming from the people within that culture,
That's right.
not somebody coming in and saying, this is how it needs to be.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this work in practice? Like, give me a real-world example.
Yeah, so he talks about churches in Japan, and he observed how many were built in a distinctly Western style, almost like replicas of those old American churches. And it made them feel foreign and out of place. They lacked that cultural resonance that traditional Japanese religious spaces have.
Yeah, it's almost like it's sending the message that Christianity is something foreign, something imported, not something that could organically belong within Japanese culture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this all circles back to that halfway bridge problem. They might be using Japanese words, but the overall message still feels culturally disconnected.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole,
Uh-huh.
right? So it's not just the language, but the forms, the aesthetics, the entire experience needs to be considered.
Exactly.
Yeah, and then he goes on to argue that we ourselves are part of the message.
Yes.
Wait, what do you mean by that? Like our personalities matter?
More than that, even. He points out how communication theory emphasizes the role of the communicator. Our actions, our attitudes, our relationships, speak volumes, often louder than our words,
Especially in cross-cultural settings.
especially in cross-cultural settings.
Okay.
He critiques this tendency in missions to just focus on tasks
Okay.
or transmitting information.
Okay, so it's not just what you say,
Yeah.
but how you say it.
Yeah.
And even more importantly, how you live it.
Yes, it's about this more holistic relational approach where the way we live and interact becomes a vital part
Uh,
of communicating the faith.
So it's like walking the walk,
Exactly.
not just talking the talk.
He reminds us that Jesus himself embodied this. He didn't just talk about love and compassion.
Yep.
He lived them out in radical ways.
I'm just picturing all those stories in the Gospels where he's healing the sick, feeding the hungry, reaching out to the marginalized. It's like his actions were a living, breathing sermon.
Exactly. And the author's arguing that we're called to follow that example. He actually points out that even scripture itself is more of a casebook full of stories and lived experiences than a dry theological textbook.
Okay, so how does this relate to insider movement specifically?
Yeah.
Like, how do they approach spiritual growth and discipleship if it's not just about words and information?
That's where the seed analogy comes in.
Okay.
Insider movements focus on planting seeds of faith rather than trying to transplant fully grown trees.
Oh,
They recognize that faith needs to take root and grow organically within a culture and develop its own unique expression.
so it's not just about plopping down a prepackaged version of Christianity.
Exactly.
It's about letting it grow and adapt to that context.
That's right. It really is like gardening, isn't it? You can't just take a plant from one climate and expect it to thrive in a totally different environment.
That makes sense.
You have to nurture it, give it the right conditions,
Yeah.
and allow it to adapt and flourish in its new surroundings.
But doesn't that take a lot of trust? Like
Yeah.
trusting that this new plant, will actually grow into something healthy and strong.
It does, and that's one of the points of tension the author addresses. He critiques this fear that some have, that if people start with certain culturally ingrained practices
Hmm.
that maybe don't align with, traditional Christianity, that they'll never move beyond them.
So it's about trusting that the Holy Spirit can work within those cultures and kind of guiding people toward a deeper understanding of their faith over time.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process, not a static one. And this brings us to another crucial piece of the puzzle, which is how different cultures view the spiritual realm.
Oh, yeah. The book talks about how Westerners tend to compartmentalize the spiritual and the human,
Yeah,
while many other cultures see them as totally intertwined. It's a huge difference.
it is a huge difference. And the author highlights how this difference in worldview can drastically impact how we approach faith and ministry,
Right.
in many cultures. The spirit world is a very real and active presence,
Yeah.
not something separate or abstract.
Yeah, so if you go in trying to impose a purely secularized version of Christianity, you're missing the mark completely.
You got it. The author stresses that insider movements
Right.
recognize and engage with the spiritual dynamics of a culture,
Okay.
acknowledging the reality and the influence of spiritual forces, both good and evil.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. It's like, remember that unfinished bridge we talked about earlier?
Right.
Maybe the missing piece isn't just language or cultural relevance,
Mm.
but a willingness to engage with the spiritual realities of that culture too.
It's all connected. It's about meeting people where they are, both physically and spiritually.
Okay.
And the author doesn't just point out the problems. He actually gives this helpful list of common pitfalls, things that often hinder true contextualization when it comes to sharing faith.
Oh, let's hear it. What kind of mistakes do we need to avoid?
So he starts with this tendency to create expensive Western-style institutions like hospitals or schools,
Yeah.
and then sort of graciously hand them over to locals.
Yeah, I could see how that would go wrong. Like, it sounds good on the surface.
The problem is, these structures are often totally unsustainable in the long run. They require resources and expertise that just aren't readily available in that context. It's like giving someone a fancy sports car without teaching them how to drive or maintain it.
Right. Or
Well-intentioned, but ultimately not helpful.
yeah, that makes sense. So it's the next pitfall to watch out for.
Avoiding or downplaying the spiritual realm. Okay, he argues that this creates a watered-down version of Christianity that fails to address the very real spiritual needs and experiences of people in many cultures.
So instead of ignoring it, we need to acknowledge it and engage with the spirit world in a way that's respectful of their beliefs and practices.
Exactly, just as Jesus did, through healing, deliverance, and confronting those demonic forces.
Right.
Then he points out this overemphasis on words. and propositional truth in a lot of traditional mission approaches.
I can see how that would get dry and academic,
Right.
like reducing a symphony to just its sheet music. You've got all the notes, but you're missing the heart and soul of the music.
Exactly. He's calling for a more holistic approach, one that incorporates stories, lived experiences, and the demonstration of faith through actions.
Okay.
He emphasizes that words alone often fall short, especially across cultures.
What about the structure of the church itself? Does he have any critiques there?
Absolutely. He tackles this tendency to impose foreign church structures and models that can feel alienating and disconnected from the local culture.
So they don't really resonate with how people in that culture already experience community and spirituality.
Yeah.
Okay.
His suggestion is that a truly contextualized church should emerge organically from within the culture, using forms and practices that resonate with the community.
So instead of building a replica of a Western church, it might look more like a gathering in a traditional communal space, using storytelling and dialogue, rather than a formal sermon, for example.
Right. He's advocating for a more dynamic, participatory approach
Yeah.
that engages with the culture rather than trying to overwrite it.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the last pitfall he calls out?
Making worship overly intellectual and lecture-focused, instead of creating space for truly experiencing God's presence and allowing for emotional and spiritual expression.
So it's like shifting from a classroom-style sermon
Yeah.
to a more experiential and culturally relevant form of worship.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how that would be more engaging for a lot of people.
Yeah. It allows people to connect with the heart of the faith in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to them, rather than imposing a foreign framework that might not resonate.
So what I'm hearing is that true contextualization isn't about just tweaking a few words or adapting a few rituals. It's about a much deeper shift in perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that there isn't just one right way to express faith or experience God.
And that God is already at work in every culture,
Mhm.
speaking through their traditions,
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
stories,
Yeah.
and their experiences.
Absolutely. And our role is to listen, to learn, and to join him in that work, allowing the message of Jesus to take root and flourish in its own unique way within each context.
So we're going back to that beautiful seed analogy.
Yeah, that's right.
Help me connect the dots here. How does the seed analogy relate to what we're talking about with insider movements and contextualization?
Think about it this way. Just like a seed contains the potential for a unique and beautiful plant, so too does the gospel hold the potential to blossom in diverse and unexpected ways within different cultural contexts.
It's about embracing that incarnational nature of our faith.
Yeah.
Just as Jesus entered into our world, becoming one of us, we're called to enter into the worlds of others.
And that requires humility, listening, and a willingness to let go of our preconceived notions.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that God is already at work in every culture. Our role is to join in with what he's doing, rather than trying to impose our own agenda.
So what does this all mean for us, the listeners? How do we apply these insights to our own lives and contexts, even if we're not missionaries or theologians?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one we're going to tackle head-on in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We're going to explore some real-world examples of insider movements in action and how this approach is being lived out in different corners of the globe.
Okay, I'm excited to hear about that.
Stay tuned.
We're back for the final part of our deep dive into insider movements. We've covered a lot of ground, from that halfway bridge analogy to the idea of the gospel as a person, not just a set of words. Now let's bring it all home. What does this actually look like in the real world?
That's where things get really fascinating, because insider movements aren't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. There's no single model or blueprint. What we see are these diverse expressions of faith emerging organically in all sorts of cultural contexts.
Okay, so paint us a picture. Give us some concrete examples of how this might play out in different parts of the world.
Let's start with Muslim background believers. In some communities, individuals are choosing to remain within their Muslim families and social circles, expressing their faith in Jesus in a way that resonates with their Islamic background.
Whoa, that's pretty radical, isn't it? I mean, traditionally, conversion has often meant a complete break from one's cultural or religious community.
Right, but the idea here is that true faith isn't about outward conformity to a set of religious practices. It's about an internal transformation of the heart. These believers might continue to participate in some Islamic rituals or customs, but their understanding and motivation are rooted in their relationship with Jesus.
So it's more about finding those points of connection and continuity, rather than demanding a total separation from their cultural background.
Yes, and this raises a huge question. What does it truly mean to follow Jesus within a specific culture? Does it require adopting Western expressions of Christianity? Or can faith be expressed authentically using the language, symbols, and practices that are already meaningful within that culture?
And based on what we've been talking about, it seems like this book is really advocating for that second option, right?
Sure.
True contextualization means allowing faith to blossom in a way that's both authentic and relevant to that specific community.
Exactly. We see this happening in Hindu contexts as well. Some believers are expressing their faith through the lens of traditional Hindu stories and concepts, finding parallels and connections that make sense within their cultural background.
So instead of rejecting those stories outright or viewing them as incompatible with Christianity, they're finding ways to reinterpret them through the lens of their faith in Jesus.
It's brilliant, really. They're recognizing the seeds of truth that God has planted in every culture and allowing those seeds to grow into something new and beautiful. It's like that master gardener who can take a variety of plants and help them thrive in a way that honors their unique characteristics.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It speaks to the creativity and diversity that we see in God's creation. And I imagine this approach leads to some pretty remarkable expressions of faith.
Well, absolutely. We see it in the music, the art, the storytelling that emerges from insider movements. People are finding ways to express their faith using the cultural forms that resonate most deeply within their communities. It's about bridging the gap between the message of Jesus and the heart of a culture.
And recognizing that God speaks to people in ways that make sense to them using their own cultural language and experiences.
Hmm.
It reminds me of that quote from the book. The gospel requires none of the original cultural forms. Such a powerful statement.
It really is. It challenges us to think critically about what's truly essential to our faith and how those core elements can be expressed in a multitude of ways across different cultures.
So, if the gospel isn't bound to a particular cultural form, what is it about? What's the core message that transcends all those cultural differences?
That's a question each person has to wrestle with ultimately.
Yeah.
But at its heart, I believe the gospel is about a relationship with God made possible through Jesus.
Mhm.
It's about experiencing his love, grace, and forgiveness and allowing that transformation to shape our lives and communities.
And that relationship can be expressed and
Yeah.
lived out in so many different ways depending on the cultural context, right?
Exactly. We're not called to impose a prepackaged version of Christianity. We're called to plant those seeds of faith and trust that God will nurture them in ways we might not even be able to imagine. It goes back to that seed analogy. If Christianity were planted in my community today, what kind of unique plant would grow from that seed? What would it look like? What fruit would it bear?
This deep dive has challenged me to think beyond my own limited perspective and to appreciate the beautiful diversity of ways in which people around the world are experiencing and expressing their faith.
It reminds us that God's story is still unfolding. And he's inviting us to join him in that story, to be his hands and feet in the world, to share his love and grace in ways that are relevant and meaningful within our own unique contexts. That's the beauty of the gospel. It's a seed that can take root and flourish anywhere, transforming lives and communities in ways we can only begin to imagine.
And that is a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic to explore. Until then, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep growing.